Bernard, I cannot hear you when you are speaking.
Okay,
Oh,
let's
now I
get
can hear you.
started. If everybody could find a seat. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So this session is essentially picking up on where we left off yesterday morning. So yesterday morning there was a lot of discussion about where are we in terms of the use of trade to achieve non-economic objectives. We've had a lot of discussions over the course of yesterday, also again this morning, looking at different dimensions of that, environment, labor, economic security, national security, also the different instruments that are being used by governments, but also by the private sector, and the connection between what the private sector is doing in the area of setting standards and mandatory regulation of what goes on inside supply chains. So the session here is what those sessions suggested, many of them that we've been hearing. So the research comes to obviously different types of conclusions, but one kind of common theme, I think, of much of the research in this area is that the instruments that are chosen by governments are not necessarily highly correlated with actually achieving the objectives that governments say they are pursuing. And of course, one of the problems with doing this type of research is it's not particularly clear what the objective actually is of the governments that are putting measures in place, and those are obviously very much multi-dimensional. But I think one of the kind of elements of the discussion yesterday morning, and I think also in a number of the parallel sessions we've had, is that there isn't a whole lot of thinking about what are the spillovers effects of what we are doing. Right, so there's a process through which we're trying to use trade to achieve a particular non-economic objective, whatever that might be. But there's not a whole lot of worry about, okay, so what does this do to innocent bystanders? What does this do to countries that might be targeted? And I think the thinking behind this panel was to have a discussion and to think about, okay, so what can we do about this? And what is being done, right? And we have people from different parts of the world who are going to kind of open the discussion on this. I'm going to try and keep a fair amount of time for questions and answers. There's a lot of people in the room, of course, who have been working on this, but there's a range of potential paths to actually deal with some of these spillover problems, but also to help improve the effectiveness of actually achieving underlying non-economic objectives. And they range from international standardization to cooperation on actually monitoring and assessing what goes on inside supply chains and the extent to which there is compliance with regulatory requirements, negotiating trade agreements, negotiating issue-specific plurilateral agreements of the type we've been seeing emerge in the area of digital and digital partnerships, and of course, potentially discriminatory clubs, right? And that is something which is very difficult to do in a WTO-compatible way because they need to be approved by everyone. But clearly there is a fair amount of talk, and I guess maybe also a little bit of action in terms of actually starting to get together with like-minded countries and cooperate in a particular area. And a lot of that really revolves around coordination. Right, so this is sometimes called concerted unilateralism, where you obviously have much more influence if what you're doing is emulated by other countries who are doing the same thing. So we have four excellent panelists in this session. Let me just briefly introduce them. First speaker is going to be Beata Javorcik, who is the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Professor of economics at Oxford University. She's also the head of the CEPR program on trade. And I think she will probably be speaking a bit towards the constituency of the EBRD, which of course, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, but also North Africa and the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The second speaker will be Chul Chung on my left here, who is the vice president at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, one of our partners. He's responsible for international trade, and he has spent a lot of time and effort and is responsible for what happens in the Pacific in terms of the Pacific economic cooperation. So I think his entry point, and he will draw very much on what has been happening in East Asia and the Pacific region, and I think that's going to be an important contribution because we're sitting here in the EUI, and in the EUI things tend to be focused very much on the EU, but of course these are global issues. Our third speaker is going to be Ignacio Garcia Bercero, who is director in DG Trade and in the European Commission. He's the former chief negotiator for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and has been responsible for multilateral strategy, multilateral affairs. Most recently, he was in Geneva yesterday, and the reason he's not with us is in part because of a strike, which I guess was Air France. I don't know what you were flying, but anyway, so I'm very happy he managed to get up very early this morning and get back to a place where he can join us online. Final speaker needs no introduction because Vera has been with us all day yesterday. Vera Torstensen is a professor of economics at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, also formerly head of, she's currently head of a Center for Global Trade and Development and Investment, but Vera has a lot of experience actually in dealing with WTO matters, representing Brazilian interests in the trade arena. So let me turn the floor over to Beata, and we'll take it from there. Beata.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. So in my brief remarks, I will argue that the world is on a path to fragmentation and that this path is risky, it's costly, not only for the countries driving these policies, but also for innocent bystanders, that is, third countries. As I'm sure you all know, that the main driver behind this push towards fragmentation is the US-China tensions, the geopolitical competition between the two countries. Now, initially, the trade tensions between the US and China were due to American dissatisfaction with globalization, loss of manufacturing jobs. These jobs in part were lost due to increased imports from China. And the Trump administration reacted to this by starting a trade war with China. Now, in Europe, we perceived that initially as an aberration, as something that was specific to that administration, but then the administration changed, the tariffs remained. And then these tariffs were accompanied by the push towards technological decoupling. And this push towards technological decoupling is part of this broader US strategy vis-a-vis China, and it's supported now by both parties in the US Congress. Now, Europe reacted to this with its strategic autonomy approach, wanting to prevent unfriendly countries from weaponizing trade and being worried about securing access to critical raw materials. Now, what's new, and this is my first point, is that more and more voices in Brussels and in Berlin are speaking about Europe joining the US effort of technological decoupling, of limiting European technology being transferred to China, of screening both outward and inward investment. And this is a very risky strategy in my view. China responded to the US CHIPS Act by restricting exports of gallium and germanium. These are two raw materials that are needed for chips production. China controls more than 90% of productions of each. And globally, actually, 30% of exports of critical raw materials are now under some form of restrictions. In 2009, it was 5%. So in the recent years, we have seen growing desire of countries to restrict exports of critical raw materials. Now, in our forthcoming transition report, which we are launching in November, We did a very simple calculation. We looked at who owns mine, who produces those critical raw materials. And then we split the world into two blocks, the Western bloc, the other bloc, based on how countries vote at the UN. And the result of these exercises will be fairly obvious to you. There are quite a few critical raw materials that are controlled mostly by the non-Western bloc. And, my main concern with this push in Europe to join the US in technological decoupling from China, my worry is that before Europe manages to secure access to these critical raw materials, it's going to escalate tensions with China. And, building mines, developing mines takes a lot of time. Export restrictions can be introduced at the stroke of a pen. And more importantly, processing some of those critical raw materials is associated with very negative environmental impacts. So appetite in Europe for processing of those materials may be actually quite limited. The second point I want to make is that sanctions on Russia have led to big changes in regional trade patterns. We have seen European and American exports to Russia plummeting, not just exports of goods that are sanctions, but also exports of other products. We have seen emergence of trade that is being intermediated. So trade exports from Europe are being intermediated via Caucasus and Central Asia and making their way to the Russian market. But what's more relevant to today's discussion is trade diversion that is taking place. As European exporters exited the Russian market, we have seen Turkey coming in, increasing its exports by more than 50%. We also have seen China replacing some of the European exports of the products that are subject to European sanctions. So essentially, trade is being now reoriented, and this is another force driving this fragmentation of the global trade. My third point is that while the global dominance of the US dollar has made the sanctions on Russia more effective, these sanctions may in the long term erode the dominance of the US dollar. 10 years ago, 10% of Chinese exports to Russia were invoiced in Chinese currency. Now it is 2/3. In the analysis we have done at the EBRD, where we looked at very detailed import data from Russia, we also see an increase in other countries using their national currencies to denominate their exports to Russia. This is true of India, this is true of United Arab Emirates, this is true of Turkey. Now, we are still talking about very small volumes, but what's quite visible is the trend. And what's perhaps the most striking is the fact that third countries started using Chinese yuan to invoice their exports to Russia. And in our recent working paper, we show that this is done by countries that have swap lines with the People's Bank of China, countries that are not party to Western sanctions, and that this effect takes off after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So where do these three trends leave us? The world is on a path to fragmentation because trade is no longer driven by economic objectives. It is geopolitics that has become the main driver of trade. And what's quite striking to me is that businesses, at least many European businesses, seem to have accepted this as something that is already happening, and they are looking at their governments, expecting help in the form of striking new regional trade agreements with friendly countries. Now, fragmentation is going to be costly. In the last transition report, we documented this, asking the what-if question. What if the world were to break into two blocks along the lines of the UN vote on Ukraine? In particular, we assessed the impact on our countries of operations, and the answer is no surprise to any trade economist. Essentially, everybody loses. And the countries that lose the most are countries like Kazakhstan that tend to have trade linkages with economies that would find themselves in two different blocks. We analyzed different scenarios in the last CPR book on this subject. The IMF has been speaking about this, but what's in a way depressing is that policymakers and businesses seem to accept the fact that, yes, fragmentation is happening, it is going to be costly, but that's the price of achieving these other non-economic objectives. So in the words of one policymaker, we are no longer in a Pareto optimal world. The fact that everybody may gain from more trade is not enough for that trade to happen. What matters these days is the relative gains. This is also a risky path. I've already mentioned access to the critical raw materials, but what few people seem to be talking about is the fact that in the times of a climate emergency, we need more rather than less cooperation. So how are we going to achieve something on the climate front where it is all about public goods in the world of growing tension, growing fragmentation, and less international cooperation? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Beata. I'm sure we'll come back to kind of some of the implications of the trends you outlined in terms of what could be done, especially to deal with those areas where we clearly need multilateral cooperation and where I see trade policy increasingly getting into the way instead of actually supporting the achievement of those objectives. Okay, our next speaker is Chul Chung. So Chul, over to you. If you want to, or you have a clicker, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just start and he'll put the thing up.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation to this very important forum to talk about this managing trade cooperation in uncertain times. Although Bernard did not recommend to use the slides, but I have some, so I'll just show some slides for the reference. Thank you. So here, I mean, you all know where we are today. Basically, the trade policy does not stand alone these days because of the so many other policies also associated with. And, many of us already know that there are some, US-China trade competition and global supply chain disruption and some domestic politics dominating and geopolitics, security. And usually the non-big issue in trade policies like labor and environment take the first seat. And something wrong with, oh, okay. So we know that in 2001, China became the 143rd member of the WTO. And at the time, Bill Clinton said that China will actually move in the right direction, and there was the expectation of the U.S. and some other Western economies. And then in 2016, you can see that China has been growing very fast, and then was integrated into the world economy. But Chinese investment actually decreased a lot around the 2016, and maybe due to some of those monitoring and the regulations policies adopted by the US and EU. So I think that there are some issues like the U.S.-China rivalry, supply chain, and economic security and industrial policy, along with the digital trade and technology, and climate change, labor, human rights, and even democracy are the kind of new trade issues. And so there are some challenges we face these days. So there are some external shocks, like that are not economic, like the pandemic and war. They become more frequent and critical to the world economy, and as they lead to protectionism and a crisis in the multilateral trading system and GVC disruptions. So we are at an inflection point in the trade, I think. And there are some non-economic objectives based on the geopolitical tensions and security-related issues. They further complicate how trade is being conducted. Today, the economic security and industrial policy are in the center of the trade policy and global supply chain restructuring and so on, mainly due to the non-economic objectives. So governments and the policymakers, rather than the markets and companies, are playing bigger roles in the trade. So, for example, the top priority of the global supply chain is resilience and stability instead of the efficiency, right? And mutual economic dependency through the free trade and globalization, such as the expansion of global supply chain, used to be believed to reduce the geopolitical conflicts. Now it's the opposite. Higher dependency presents more security risks, as it can be weaponized by trading partners, if not the strong allies. So we face tough challenges in restoring the rules-based order in the world economy and the trading system. I think that there are some changes, and we are moving from globalization to strategic competition, especially in technology, and from neoliberalism to government intervention, maybe from free trade and free and open trade to strategic trade policy, including the industrial policy. And we have some concerns over the economic coercion and deterrence issues. So maybe, from the trade agreements and negotiations to maybe some selective cooperation or selective globalization to deal with this. So before I go to the other way forward, there are some concerns. For example, a colleague from the Peterson, Chad Bowen, for example, he said that the U.S. has a lot of concerns about some critical industries like semiconductor and batteries. They are too much concentrated around the East Asia, like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China. So U.S. is sort of nervous about this, too much concentration geographically. But is it a real concern to the U.S. or to East Asian countries? For example, with this, strategic competition between the U.S. and China, the impacted country was Korea, because Korea is trading a lot with China, also with the United States, especially in the industry of semiconductor. Samsung and SK Hynix, they have the factories in China, And they are greatly affected by some of the policies legislated by the U.S. Congress, like the IRA and the Chips and Science Act. So these security related and also these are also economic objectives to me. It's not like non-economic objectives. Why? Because it's not just about the current profit in the short run, but also they think about the future profit and the future growth engine for the economy. So they are looking at the long run. So that's why we have this Chips and Science Act and IRA. And as we know, that elephant in the room is China. And the strategic competition with China. So why semiconductors? It's a Achilles heel of China to the United States. And there are some legitimate reasons for the economic security to compete with China, for example. And there are some industrial policy using the subsidies, and they are targeting like the reshoring and using the combination of, you say onshoring and nearshoring, maybe friendshoring and the ally shoring. But let's think about it. I mean, GVC expansion was market-driven, not the policy-driven. So there was a reason behind the geopolitical concentration, right? And there are some countries, adapting some kind of initiatives or some kind of strategy to use China plus one or China plus alpha, and trying to move out of the China and into where? Maybe India and maybe the Southeast Asia. But when you think about the concentration, for example, the petroleum, where is it geographically concentrated? It's Middle East, right? It's not the market driven. It's kind of endowment actually dictated that, right? Now there's a we should think about okay. So those raw materials are kind of the geographically endowed already. But when you think about another factor of production like the labor workers and some other things like infrastructure, right? It could be concentrated because of some reasons, and maybe labor productivity differences. It could be reflected in wages, but not perfectly, and the whole ecosystem of the industry and institutions, and maybe some kind of culture, right? So this should be taken into account. Including like for example, these days the TSMC of Taiwan and some Samsung, they decided to invest in the United States, but they worry about the quality control and the quality of the labor they can hire in the United States and the time of the production processes and so on. So it's all the integrated. And that's going to be a big problem. Okay. So I think there are also reasons for industrial policy, and according to the Gary Pisano in 2009 Harvard Business Review, recovering American competitiveness. So at the time, U.S. firms actually went out for the outsourcing. And because they think that they do not have competitive edge in producing certain process. But there was a disaster, according to him, because today's low-value manufacturing operations have some implications for tomorrow's innovative new products. So it's like the leaking know-hows in the manufacturing production processes to overseas. So governments think that, wait, we cannot just let the markets and companies make decisions freely, because they do not have this economic objectives in their equation. So, what are the cooperation? Maybe there are some prerequisites for the trade cooperation. First, I think we should align the non-economic objectives with the economic objectives, right? And we try to internalize some of those costs that are not traditionally included in the economic models. And we should think about the government's or country's objective function versus the private sector's objective function. And second, what do we mean by the rules-based order? I think it's related to the fair competition. It should be guaranteed so that we can have trust in the market mechanism. And subsidies and the government interventions, maybe it could be the explicit or implicit, and they should be dealt with. And third is there should be a channel for communication to resolve differences and conflicts. So these days you see that there's a decoupling evolved into the de-risking, right? Thanks to the European heads up. So it's like the opening up for the dialogue. So I think the way forward, there are various ways of the thinking. So I'll just leave that for the later discussion, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jewel. I guess the way forward is on your slide there. So I don't know, how do we get rid of this slide? Yes. All right, great. Okay, so Ignacio.
Well, thanks a lot, Bernard, and it's a big pleasure to be able to participate in this panel, although it would be, of course, much more fun if I could be there in Florence. You said that we were going to be making our presentations talking about different constituencies. I mean, I could, of course, talk about the European Union as being my constituency, but if you would allow me, I think I would talk about the WTO. What are the implications of the current tensions in the global trading system for multilateralism and for the WTO as an institution? And I think we would all agree that there are basically three sources of tension which are actually impacting on global trade. Beata has talked a lot about geopolitical tensions, so I would not say a lot about that. Perhaps just one comment. If one wants to understand the evolution of the European Union positioning on a number of issues, one really needs to integrate the impact of the war in Ukraine. I think that that's something which has had a major impact in terms of how the European Union sees itself in the global geopolitical picture. There is the geopolitical tensions, but there are also the tensions which are linked to distortions of competition linked to the role of the state in the Chinese economy. This predates the geopolitical tensions. If one goes back to the origins of the US-China conflict during the Trump presidency, it was much more guided by economics rather than simply by geopolitics. But the source of tension continues to be very much there. And it happens in an area where the rules of the WTO are particularly weak, are particularly in need of being updated. That is to say, rules on subsidies and issues relating to competitive neutrality. And third, but absolutely not least, there is the urgency of the climate transition. I find it a bit difficult to refer to climate change as a non-economic objective. I mean, climate is so existential that it inevitably impacts all aspects of your economic policies, including the trade policy. But at the same time, it is very clear that it is a source of tensions because of the different responses to how to achieve net zero objectives and because of the different policy tools which are being used in order to achieve those objectives. I mean, it's clearly not the same to rely primarily on carbon pricing as the instruments to guide the climate transition, that to rely much more, for instance, on subsidies. And the mix between these different tools is also having an impact as a source of tensions on the global trading system. So how well equipped is the WTO to limit those tensions? to help to address spillover effects? Is the response that should come from the WTO based on its adjudication function, if we were going to be able to restore a functioning dispute settlement system? Is it going to rely more on negotiations to update the rules of the WTO? Is it going to be providing more of a forum for multilateral deliberation? Or should we basically come to the view that the WTO is not going to be able to effectively provide any of those three functions, and that we should be looking therefore much more into our trade agreements, into different words of cooperation among like-minded countries? I would argue that if one actually looks into the policy mix, inevitably there's going to be a combination of the different elements which I have mentioned, and that perhaps it's not so useful from that perspective to talk broadly about non-economic objectives and to look more concretely in which is the type of interfaces that we are actually discussing. I would argue that the role of the WTO and of other forms of trade cooperation is not the same when we are talking about the trade and security nexus, when we are talking about how to level the playing field, or when we are talking about the interface between trade and the climate transition. So let me just make a few comments on each of them. Now, when it comes to the trade and security nexus, I would make a distinction between what we could call hardcore security concerns, sanctions as a response to a military invasion, export controls. These are the traditional tools of national security. And of course, they are becoming much more important these days because of the reality of the geopolitical tension that we are facing. But the discussion has also become broader because the concept of economic security, it is broader than the concept of action which is relating to national security. And it includes also looking into the issue of the vulnerability of global value chains, and the which circumstances that vulnerabilities can be weaponized. And that implies a whole new area of activities on which trade policy is also inevitably affected. Now, if you are looking into hardcore security, I would say the framework of rules is the one provided by Article 21, the national security exception of the WTO. There are different views about how these rules should be applied. There is the US perspective, which considers that the national security exception should be self-judging. There is the perspective of the European Union and others that consider that there has to be very significant discretion when countries rely on national security, but at the same time they have to be guardrails to prevent abuse. The important question which I think we are going to have to face is what are the alternatives to litigation when it comes to potential abuses of the national security exception? Is there a role for more deliberation on areas relating to either the national security or economic security? I would argue that it's going to be very difficult to imagine the WTO providing a forum for deliberation when it comes to national security, and even difficult, although perhaps to a certain extent it's more feasible when it comes to broader economic security concerns. But there may be other forums where those type of deliberation can actually take place. So if it comes to the trade security nexus, the WTO has a role to play, because after all, the framework of rules is provided by the WTO because of the national security exception. But I think if you are looking into how to enhance deliberation, you are going to have to be looking more into other fora where countries can discuss those issues together. Now, when it comes to issues relating to the leveling the playing field, there I think the situation is different. The current framework of international rules provides a basis for countries to take action to defend their market vis-à-vis distortions of competition linked to subsidization, but it's not really effective if you're actually trying to look into the global impacts of subsidization. So this means that from my point of view, there's a very strong case to look into how to modernize the rules of the WTO on subsidies. By the way, not only on industrial subsidies, also absolutely on agricultural subsidies. This is the big unfinished agenda from the DDAs. I think you need to look both into agriculture and into industrial subsidies. You also need to look into the environmental dimension of subsidies. That's why I think it's so important that the WTO concluded a first phase agreement on fisheries subsidies. But it is clear that this is an area which is going to be extremely difficult, politically very sensitive, where I certainly think that deliberation has a role to play, because in order to negotiate on those issues, you probably need to, before that, to create the common intellectual understanding that will be necessary for a negotiation to succeed. So that's why I think that on this issue, you can't just simply rely on deliberation, but you would also need to integrate deliberation as a component to move forward to what is certainly going to be a very difficult negotiation, but which is necessary if you wanted to prevent the cause of subsidy raises and increasing tensions in the global trading system. So then I come to the third area of tensions interface, which is the trade and climate interface. I would say that from the trade point of view, there are fundamentally three issues. One is the impact of subsidies on the environment, both positive and negative, and I have already mentioned that. The second one is the use of trade-related measures to achieve climate goals. And the third one is what steps can be taken in the trading system to facilitate investment in clean technologies. Again, if you actually look into the rules of the WTO, I would argue that Article 3, Article 20 provide the basic framework of rules so that you can design your measures in a manner which is consistent with your WTO commitments. In an ideal world, I think it would be interesting to explore where members of the WTO have the common will to clarify the interface between Article 3 and Article 20 and try to provide common guidance about how to implement and design trade-related climate measures. In practice, I think this is unlikely to be feasible. I think there are probably going to be too many divergences to arrive at a common basis on which to seek such clarification. There's, of course, always the option of adjudication. It would not be the most efficient one, and that's why I think this is an area where I see a lot of scope for enhanced deliberation in the WTO, providing a basis for countries to try to ensure that when they implement measures which view to achieve certain climate-related objectives, they can also take into account and reflect the concerns of countries which are impacted by those measures. And I think that providing a forum for that dialogue in the WTO, from my point of view, is one of the very important functions that the WTO could actually be playing in the current environment. I think you have also raised a question about clubs, to what extent you could actually try to achieve a climate objective in a coordinated manner by countries that share a similar ambition when it comes to net zero. This is certainly something which it is actually worth exploring. It is certainly a possible option, but it would have to be very clear that any action that any of the individual members of such a club takes has to be consistent with the international obligations of each individual members. It cannot be seen as being a reason for countries collectively to act in a manner which is contrary to the obligations in the WTO. Which is again why I think it's going to be so important that if you want to deal with issues like the climate transition, you have a scope for multilateral deliberation. You may have a scope also for a number of for a subset of WTO members to take coordinated action, but you need to be able to invest in both. You cannot just look into what you do with a subset of countries without at the same time being ready to enter into deliberation in a multilateral forum. So as I said, I think that the WTO still has a role to play. Clearly, it's not just the WTO. You need to be looking into a whole set of different tools of trade policy to navigate what is clearly a much more tense global trading environment than the one that we have been witnessing for quite for quite some time. So I think I would leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Ignacio, especially for focusing on what the WTO, what we could potentially collectively do in the WTO, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in the questions and answer session and discussion. So, last but not least, Vera, over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation again. It's a pleasure to speak of all the previous speakers, because I can go up a step further. It's clear that it's fantastic that I was in many seminars in this year, and I never heard so many times the word geopolitics or geo-economics. So this is new. This is new for a group of that always discuss about trade. But it's not clear what the consequence of the fact that the world is completely new. And what is the impact of geoeconomics in our world, right? We are living in two clear wars, right? But there's a third big war in Africa going on in the Sahel region, please. And there are quite strong shifts around the world. I can talk about Latin America. Are you paying attention what's going on there? In the sense of the size of the Chinese investment. So you heard you see in the newspapers that the US is worried about that Chinese invest in Peru, and Mercedes talk about this, a deep water port and so on. Take a look what China is doing in Argentina. The swap of 20 billions and in exchange of what? Take a look what China is doing in Brazil. So this is a huge shift, and this is certainly going to affect the world. Let me move this is a house of academic house, right? Let me go to the consequence of that we are living in a geo-economic world. I like to think that I read in a paper that geoeconomics is killing neoliberalism. Look, we are living in this such a kind of discussion about what's going on investment, or what's going on value change and so on. My point is, Bernard, are you changing your classes for next year, your program, because of this reality? Are you going to be to teach your students the same thing about that, how liberalism is good, how to have, take a look what's going on, the concentration of finance around the world. What's the consequence of being all the money going to the financial sector? What the consequence of this for the rest of the world? Let's go now to the other big area, important in this house also. How about international law? You, professor, where is Pedro? The question is, are you going to teach the same thing for your students? Come on. What is international law? What's going on in the Security Council? What's going on in the law of the sea? What's going on, what's China in the South Asian Sea? Last half an hour, we have a marvelous presentation about on the economics of music. What's going on with intellectual property? Forget about it. We are talking about the new sea, the skies, and the space, and so on. Are you thinking that you are in the same world and you are going to teach the same untrue things to your students? The point is, and how about trade? Our word, right? Now tariffs. I agree with Beata. Look, the United States raised tariff, Biden keep it, and guess what's going on? Mexico is raising also the tariffs. You know, enlarging the protection of the ex-NAFTA countries against other countries. Guess what happened with steel? Okay, you have a barrier to steel getting to the United States. Guess where the steel is going on? The steel from China is being poured in Brazil, and the industry there is also asking for to raise tariff 25%. This is a real world, right? On the war of ships, okay, what we are going to do? Can we divide the world in two because of again, the geopolitical structure? Critical material, fantastic. I love to listen to Beata. Where are you going to mine your minerals, Beata? Not under the dome, the forest, neither the Notre Dame. You are going to, it is critical material for in a lot of countries, but the question is, ask for the Indians in Chile about what's going on the mines over there. Ask about in Brazil, Indians, what's going on with illegal mining in the Amazon and so on. You are going to mine, destroy the forest, and you are going to pollute the water and impact the Indians. Yes, because you are going to mine and process in developed countries, in Congo and so on. What's going on in Niger? Niger is the problem of uranium. This is the new reality. And with all these words completely transformed, and you will sorry to talk about Article 20 and 21. Sorry, it's only a kind of a thing that to keep the word as it is in our small world. And I think that we have to go a little bit further. And I was really depressed after our panel on dispute settlement yesterday. Yes, come on, I'm living in this WTO issue for more than 30 years. I think more than Becero already. But again, you cannot keep the thing as the same. Why? And then I have a proposal, not to be too destructive, but the proposal is why not to move to guidelines? Look, we try plurilaterals. What happened? India said no. India said, no, we are not going to accept plurilaterals because we are not going to keep the power of. So instead of rule-based as a hard law, what not to think about for a period, till the transition period, only for soft law, guidelines, in the sense that let's give us the direction to go. How to deal with environment, how to deal with critical minerals, how to deal with even on subsidies. Let us discuss direction instead of details and hard law and keep the dispute settlement alive. It's not going to be alive for a while. So, the point and the last point is, please pay attention. In this world, now this new world driven by war and driven by geo-economics, what's going on is a shift of the global north and global south issue. This is true. And you think that Ukraine and even what's going on in Israel and Hamas and so on is a thing of global world. It is in the sense, but it's not the main concern of the South. The main concern is hunger, is food production, is poverty, is the concentration of, again, income in the North countries. And this is a thing that you are not listening all the think tanks to think about. What you are doing in this area, what the IMF is doing, what the World Bank is doing. Again, what is is a fantastic. Now Brazil is involved with the G20. And I discovered the track, a political track, and the financial tracks. A lot of things are going on the financial track of on the IMF and so on. I mean, the taxation, how to deal with fiscal paradise and so on. But again, you have to deal with much more on the issue of concentration of income and the real problem of the South, of the real South. You are spending too much time on the problems of the North. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. So I think there was a lot put on the table. I'm sure many of the people who spoke will not be agreeing with other people who spoke, and I think that's actually part of what we're trying to do here. One thing I can say in terms of what you said, are we changing the way we teach? I know of one person who is sitting in this room who had to completely revamp his trade course to actually incorporate all of the things we're talking about now, but the bottom line is that a lot of what we actually teach in terms of, basic trade, drivers and determinants of trade, etc., are all continue to remain valid, except we need to find better ways of incorporating these other things into what we actually teach. So I think point well taken, and I'm sure many of the people who are in this room who are teaching will actually recognize or your point, and I think they're already doing it, right? So I think in that sense, we're not as bad as the macro people. The people who teach macroeconomics.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so do any of you who are on the panel want to react to things you've heard, clarify? Let me know. No, otherwise we have a room full of people who I'm sure are going to be very interested in asking questions and taking this further. So the floor is open.
Can somebody open the door so a little bit of air comes in?
So anyway, so those of you who want to ask questions, comment, just use the microphones on the side of the room.
Hi, I'm Mark Koplovich. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the panel. And I guess in this vein of changing how we teach and think about trade, as someone who studies international political economy, I guess I wanted to challenge a little the framing of the idea that geopolitics is new, right? I mean, I think there was geopolitics in the 1970s with US protectionism around the collapse of Bretton Woods. There was geopolitics in the 1980s about the rise of Japan and strategic trade theory and voluntary export restraints and whatnot. So I guess I wanted to hear a little more from all of you on to what degree you think this is really a change in the way geopolitics plays out in trade, or more about the scope and scale of it, and because it's China and because it's a rival with an authoritarian regime as opposed to rivals with democratic countries in the past. But I see a lot more continuity in some ways across the decades in how geopolitics has played out. And sort of related to that, there's been a lot of talk of non-economic objectives, and I guess I would just sort of say that non-trade and non-economic are not the same thing, right? I think about it in some ways as we're talking about climate, or we're talking about other finance or other types of issues. They're also economic issues. They just may have different distributional consequences across countries and within countries. And so sort of interested in your thoughts on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. And meanwhile, if any...
Yeah, look, I agree fully with you. Geopolitics is there for since the beginning of the world. The new thing is that we live in a world that was made by the kind of had the leadership of the U.S. Okay, all this stuff on the point that the United States is dysfunctional now, right? And that's the way, come on, how you explain what's going on in Israel and Ukraine and so on? It's a kind of shift of paradigm. And my point is, are you changing the way you are thinking, or you are going to teach the same things, our comparative advantages, all the things? And I love the macroeconomic points. That neoliberalism is good, much better than the protectionism. Come on, what's going on around the world, right? It's not like that.
I think everybody wants to intervene. So, Chul, why don't you take off, and then we'll go to Beata and Ignacio.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you for your comment, and I agree with you. I think the past couple of decades with the globalization and golden era of free trade is actually an exception, but we take it for granted. So I remember when I was young, I mean, I'm still young, but when I was younger, much younger, like in 1980s, in Korea, all the newspapers always showed that Super 301 from the United States, all kinds of things, all kinds of trade disputes, and it's not really geopolitics, but there are certain tensions and conflicts, but we forgot about it. Since the 1990s and so on. So I think it has been there always. We just came back to that. And I think the non-economic objectives related the issues actually have very different distributions, implications. I think that's a very important point. Thank you.
Okay, Beata.
Thank you. So many thanks to Vera for challenging those of us who teach to change the way we teach, and for Mark's response. I think the issues are not new. There is a literature on industrial policy. I think what's somewhat different is the size of China, right? Because, in many of the models, we like to think about small countries. And I think it's very hard to apply that assumption to China. But what is different now is, I think, where the literature has moved. So the trade literature no longer aims to answer questions that are useful. We have sort of moved more towards the world of poetry, where the models are beautiful, the calibrations are elegant, and that's enough to gain respect and a publication in top journal. And I think what we need to do is to go back to usefulness being a criterion in research, because otherwise, as people studying international trade, we are going to become obsolete and completely useless to policymakers. Thank you.
I agree completely. Ignacio.
Yeah, no, I wanted to comment on this issue about how far what we are witnessing is not so fundamentally different to what we had already experienced in the past, in the 80s. And it is certainly true that geopolitics have always been there in the trading system. I would very much agree with that premise. But I think that there are two fundamental issues which are different. The first one has already been mentioned by Beata. China is the largest trading nation in the world. And you're actually having a geopolitical conflict which is actually involving the two largest trading nations in the world, both of which participate in the same rule-based multilateral institutions. So that's a new factor, something that was not there in the past. And secondly, tensions in the past, in the case of the United States, they always led to the United States trying to play a leading role towards reinforcing international rule-based institutions. The tensions of the 80s with Japan, voluntary export restraints, were part of the tension that generated the launch of the Uruguay round negotiations, where clearly the US was playing a leading role in terms of reinforcing trade institutions. That's not the world in which we are living today. So I think those two elements, in my view, are quite new, are different in terms of the implication to the global trading system than what was the case in the past. Just one little comment on dispute settlement. Unfortunately, I could not be present in the panel yesterday, and maybe I would be very depressed if I had been there. But I still think it's really so critical to try to ensure that we are able to restore a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. Because quite frankly, I think that we are at a little bit of a turning point in terms of the perception of the WTO. If we are not able to find a way forward to restore a functioning dispute settlement system, what is going to be very fundamentally eroded is the respect for the rules of the WTO. And we are seeing that issue increasingly being debated, happening in Europe. And I think we don't really have so much time to try to see whether or not it is possible to maintain the core sustainability of the rule-based trading system. So from that point of view, I think that what happens over the next year or so in Geneva is going to be quite critical, because we are a little bit at a turning point in where we actually go into a situation where basically there is no rules anymore and to a pure power dynamic, or where we find a way to try to harness those power conflicts in a manner we do not result in total fragmentation.
Thanks. So just on that session that Vera was referring to on dispute settlement, I mean, one of the things I took away from it is that there actually is quite a bit of innovation and experimentation going on, given that we no longer have the system that was set up in the WTO with the appellate body. So all of that suggests, one, there is still interest in pursuing kind of adjudication of disputes, but also a willingness and a capacity to actually think about how you do that in a different way, how you might do that more effectively, how you design it. So I think there's a lot of activity going on, and I think one of the challenges is, and this is one of the questions I asked in that particular session, and unfortunately there was nobody there who was actually involved in discussions in Geneva, or who could speak. But I think one of the questions is, to what extent are these innovations actually being put forward? Is there a discussion as to, okay, so why did this fail? What can we do better? actually building on what we are already doing, right? So this is no longer academic pie in the sky. It's the governments are actually doing things in different areas, in different ways, to settle trade conflicts. We have a question here, and in general, just if you want to ask questions, is either go to the microphone as opposed to just raising your hand. So feel free to come.
Thank you. I'm Kostas Karantirinis. I'm from Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. I'm an agricultural economist. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful panel. I have, if I take advantage, I have two questions, one general and one specific. My general question is that we heard a lot about non-economic objectives, and yet there was a little mention by Vera, for example, about hunger, but we didn't hear about the SDGs. We are very far. We have achieved only a very little portion of SDGs, and we are only 7 years from the 2030 target. I wonder if you can enlighten us. How much this plays into the negotiations, into trade, and what should we expect? Is it really a parameter there? And this is more specific. My question goes to Ignacio. Ignacio, the Commission, the EU has already advanced with the Green Deal, with the farm-to-fork strategies. You said that there is a lot of discussion there about subsidies and the relation to the environment. How much what should we expect out of this? Should we expect less subsidies in the EU? Is the EU willing to give up something, or they have already, with these advancements, they said we did our part, so we expect the rest of the world to do? Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's take one more question before I go back to the panel, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Tim Ellemann. I'm a PhD candidate here at the European University Institute, and I'm researching outbound investment screening. Now, today we've heard lots about paradigm shifts and about economic security and about restricting governmental intervention in technology transfer, which the ideas about outbound investment screening are now concerning the most. What I wonder is, while our trade restrictions at the moment usually entail some public security, public order test, or an essential security interests test, or a national security interests test, with discussing how to combine economic interests with non-economic goals, should we stop thinking about a national security test and think about a union interest test, as we, for instance, have in trade remedies, of course, a little bit differently. But are we still talking about security when we talk about economic security, for instance, or should it be interests? Thank you.
Excellent question. So, Ignacio, I think you're on the hook on that. But again, anybody feel free.
I think to be on the hook on all the three questions. Now, on the question about SDGs, something that was actually, I think, quite interesting is that for the first time the WTO concluded the negotiation with a specific response to one SDG. That was the negotiation on fisheries subsidies. And it is probably true that if there was not the political impulse coming from this SDG commitment, it would have been much more difficult to conclude this negotiation. And now, as there are more discussions going on in the area about how to try to revitalize, for instance, negotiations on agriculture in the WTO, there is much more reference also about the SDGs providing rationale and political impulse to get some negotiations moving forward. Now, it is not simple because we all know how difficult multilateral negotiations are in the WTO. When you refer to the issue of subsidies, let me indicate first on agricultural subsidies. It's perhaps not very well known that in the Buenos Aires ministerial meeting, the European Union made a joint proposal with Brazil to try to advance on the reduction of trade distorting domestic support on agriculture. So we are certainly quite interested in trying to find a way of revitalizing the negotiations on agricultural subsidies in the WTO. And we are actually quite concerned about the risk that we enter into a subsidy race when it comes to industrial subsidies, because it would make it very, very difficult for the EU to maintain its disciplines on the state aid, which has been one of the cornerstones for the building up of the European Union single market. But when you are facing the highly subsidized competition from China, when you are facing something with the IRA in terms of the local content requirements, but also in terms of tax credits, which are actually uncapped, that creates a lot of tensions also in terms of the European Union, with pressure to try to somehow emulate what others are doing. So from that point of view, having better disciplines internationally on subsidies is something that we are quite interested in promoting in the context of the WTO. Now, when it comes to the issue of national security and economic security, I think it's very important that if we're actually talking about measures which are intended to restrict trade or investment, export controls, investment screening, that we stick to the national security rationale as reflected in the provisions of Article 21 of the WTO, and that we don't try to broaden it into a much broader universe of potential actions. This being said, economic security is a broader concept than national security. It is also about how you enhance the resilience of your value chains, how you diversify your economies when you have a high dependence from countries that can be a source of concern. And it's clear, as you are looking into the tools that you want to develop in those circumstances, you need to be able to establish a solid risk assessment so that you actually identify what are the risks, but also what are the economic costs of different risk mitigation strategies that you might want to develop. So perhaps in this broader concept of economic security, yes, you need to be looking into issues which are broader than those that relate to strictly the national security test. But at the same time, I don't think that we would want to see a situation in which import restrictions or the export controls are applied for reasons which are not connected to the scope which is currently covered by the national security exceptions of the WTO.
Thanks. Anyone else want to come in on these questions?
Maybe not directly, but I think we cannot think of the trade policy, for example, without thinking about industry policy these days. Not industrial policy, but also like environmental policy and considering the national security issues as well. So I think combining this economic interests with the non-economic interests as well, we need to do more of the integrated and interdisciplinary research to find a way for the economy or the governments to do some policies, relevant policies.
I have a question to Inácio. Inácio, sorry. All the times that I saw you in the internet, you are in the place that there's a stair, and the stairs goes to the ceiling. And my question is also that: what's the meaning of this? Do you have the secret to go? And then I came to my mind when I became too depressed about around the world. I have a question for you. Do you ever take a look on what's going on with the telescope the John Webb telescope? This is the funny thing for you. Come on, I studied physics before being mathematics, studied mathematics. So take a look on your Googles, James Webb Observatory. And because they put the telescope behind the land, and then they can do different lights and put the sun in the other place. You can see the planets, the new clouds, and so on. And this is important for you because you are living in the world of wars here. And how about if you put all our effort to discover what's going on there? because studying this, the photographs that are coming to the Earth now, you are going to see that we humans, we are bacteria. We know nothing. We are bacteria with spectacles because you can only see in 3 dimensions. That's it, and we cannot see anything. You know, even the sky. And this is the thing more or less that I remember seeing the sky of Inácio and seeing that we are, you know, again, discussing the nitty-gritties on a world that changed completely, such as high speed. I agree with the objectives of Millennium Development and so on, but come on, nothing happened. Sorry, Inácio, we are in the WTO for more than 30 years, you and me. Come on, what happened? Are you still discussing fish subsidy about 20 years? We need to change these things. We need, I think we need a war, a bomb inside the WTO for persons to change and try to speak about the real. You are talking about nitty-gritties, Article 20 and 21, and use an old language because we have to straighten it, because we cannot move. We have to get out of this box and try to see how to get it. This, my humble proposal is to go to guidelines, forget about the same hard law. But when I say these lawyers came there, you cannot do this. You need to have hard law. Come on, this is the world we are here. We are living it. Lawyers, always they are.
Vera, I think there is much less distance between you and Ignacio than you seem to think.
How about the start?
But also...
Exactly.
But also what Beata
No, I mean,
was
actually...
saying. No, I just think a lot of these things are actually highly connected.
No.
So in terms of the criticism of what we as economists do and what we reward ourselves in terms of how we, you know, where we have to publish, what we have to do, your point on deliberation, Vera's point on guidance and soft law, I mean, all these things are kind of coming together because I think the common denominator here is let's try and figure out, right, what actually could help move everyone towards a more efficient, more effective outcome in terms of dealing with these trade tensions. And so I think that's all I want to say is I think there is a red thread here. So we're not that far away from each other. So anyway, Beata, Ignacio.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, this is actually the stairs of my attic, so that I can't give you. No, I mean, actually, I think there are more things happening in the WTO than the outside world seems to see these days. I'm a little bit surprised that despite having such a powerful advocate for the WTO, our Dr. Negosi, there's still this very strong perception about gloom and immobilism in the WTO. And I understand it because the WTO can be a very frustrating institution, but I would totally agree first, Vera, on what you said. Very rarely it is going to be possible to negotiate hard rules internationally these days. So the more that we can actually make use of other instruments like guidelines, deliberations of law, the better. I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation, when it comes to the trade and climate interface, that's where I think there's a lot of space to do things. There's a lot of discussion and experimentation when it comes to dispute settlement, and I'm afraid that I cannot give details because we are supposed to have stricter confidentiality requirements. But I hope that when we actually come out with the text coming of the discussions which are currently taking place in Geneva about how to reform the dispute settlement system, it will be seen that there's a lot of creativity, a lot of ideas about how to foster alternative means of resolving dispute, about how to have more accountable system of adjudication. So there's quite a lot of creativity going on. And as you know, there's a lot of activity also in terms of plurilateral negotiations. Let's not forget that we have now concluded in the WTO a plurilateral agreement on domestic services regulation and a plurilateral agreement on investment facilitation for development. Yes, they still need to be formally integrated in the system. Yes, there are some issues with India and South Africa, but things are moving forward. But what I'm meeting more with politics is because if the outside perception is that the WTO does not work anymore, I think that inevitably is going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the real problem is that countries are going to increasingly decide to ignore the rules. And that's the real problem that we are currently facing in Europe, and I think in many other countries.
Beata.
If I may pick up on Ignacio's point, right? If countries start ignoring the rules of the game and we are in a free-for-all world, business is going to lose out. And that brings me to the question why business is not speaking up about fragmentation or not speaking up enough. And this brings me back to the time prior to Brexit referendum. Businesses were not speaking up because they did not want to alienate their pro-leave customers and because they thought that Brexit wasn't going to happen. And now I fear we are in a similar situation. Many businesses think, fragmentation is not going to happen. And, we are not going to speak in favor of multilateralism because some of our customers are no friends of China, so we don't want to alienate them. And then there is another group of businesses, sort of more forward-looking ones, more informed ones, and those actually already see where the world is heading, and they are adjusting to that future. They, in a sense, have given up on lobbying for maintaining the multilateral rules, and they are now thinking about the ways they will adjust and how they should push their government to help them adjust. And I think that is very depressing, right? Because we see the world has changed, as Vera mentioned, and nobody wants to adjust multilateral institutions to that new world because they already accepted, they've given up on them in a way.
Okay, so Vera has just given me instructions that I should be optimistic, which I am by nature. So I think are there any other questions? There, one more. Let's take one more question and then we'll wrap it up because we're reaching the end of our time slot. Please.
PhD researcher here at the Department of Law at UI. And I come from China. I come from China. I studied EU law in China and also here. So this is what I want to first share some of my observations. Like, can you imagine how the atmosphere in Beijing about like the same forum, World Trade Forum in Beijing? So the top Chinese lawyers, the top Chinese economists, they're discussing how to react to the unilateral legal instruments adopted by EU, by US against China, and how the Chinese business can save their operations from all these law fences. So you see, this is my observation at this position to see how differences. So what I want to say is there is a normative divergence here, like from the Beijing and also Brussels are here. People understand that what is happening is in a different way. And from Chinese perspective, at least from Chinese academia, what people think is, Chinese people work diligently and under Chinese model, which is quite different from the values here. So they don't understand why when the Chinese has the emerging industries and companies emerging, and then there will be an investigation and also like instruments to handle. So there is a divergence. So the outcome is without a useful or the fragments in the bilateral or unilateral or the multilateral solutions, then EU or US comes to their unilateral domestic instruments. And so does China. China's just adopt the blocking statutes, just adopt the other laws like external relations law with the extraterritorial effects. It's like learning from the EU's normative power ways to react to the legal effects of the laws here. So my question is, from this perspective, do you see other solutions or path in the futures other than a tit-for-tat lawfare or a trade war? And the other question is, like, yesterday we mentioned a famous high fence, small yard. So you see the fence is higher and higher, and inevitably China is taking actions and is also higher. So do you see any exits to leave this smaller yard? Or it is just like the steps, like the professors there, lead to nowhere and go to the roots? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
I think that is an excellent question, and all of you can come in. I think, just to abuse my position here at the microphone, so I think one of the things that really needs to be done much more is to have domestic debate, domestic assessments, domestic deliberate, to use Ignacio's deliberation term, to actually kind of better understand what is the effect of what is all this stuff on us, and is what we're doing actually going to help us achieve our objectives, and then actually forcing the policymakers to say, what is our objective? What are we actually trying to do? And I think there's too much going on in terms of people automatically saying we need industrial policy for this, or we need export controls for that, without a good understanding of, okay, is this effective? Can it be done more efficiently? So those processes, and I think it goes back to the question to Ignacio, shouldn't we have a union interest trust where we actually consider these different types of dimensions? And I think that's a bit what's missing, right? So we're still a bit too much in a silo world in terms of the design of policy, where we're not thinking about what the effects are across these different objectives when we're using a particular instrument. But anyway, we've used up our time, so 1 minute for everybody to say a final word, and then we'll close.
WHO make a marvelous study, general equilibrium model, showing that a world divided in two, the loss should be to 5 to 10%, something like that. But this is not enough, the economic reasoning against the different world. And I can tell you, being an old professor, that you know how this can be resolved. Only if you, and it will be for us, academics, what you have to either you negotiate, and I agree with Beata, business are completely alienated of all these things that are waiting, getting a lot of money, Beata. They are not worried about what's going on in the world. That's true. And the point is that either we discuss and reinvent the old multilateral systems, or we are going to have the solution, as always, a war. And we are going to have a war, against China and United States, or a proxy of this again. And this is a thing that cannot be accepted. And we are silent, discussing nitty-gritties, instead of thinking hard. Ignacio, you are a negotiator. It's amazing. It's amazing how the European Union cannot move and do things and go get... you love regulations, right? You are a continent of regulations. It's amazing how you cannot do and change, have to change the system. Sorry for that, but that's the way that's going on.
Okay. Chu, then Beata, and I'll give Ignacio the last word.
Yesterday, I think the Petros mentioned the Kindleberger trap. I think I understand the China's maybe interpretation is different, but the reason why we face this kind of the economic security issue actually goes back to China as well. So Chinese economy, I mean the many other countries do not think the Chinese economy is a market economy. Of course, some others think that, but and this kind of the state capitalism is a kind of whole new different challenge to the market economies, right? Because we could not compete with the Chinese companies, because behind the Chinese companies there is the huge Chinese government. If that's there, that's not going to be a fair competition in the market economy. And all those, almost all the countries try to attract investment, because the inward investment, I mean FDI inflows create jobs and opportunities and contribute to the economic growth. That happened, but as I showed, 2016, right? There was the top, and then it's not like not any investment, right? The countries are, they are alert on the certain investment could be dangerous. So that's why the trade policy, not just trade, but investment-related policies combined with the economic security, and that's the puzzle that we need to solve.
Beata.
Let me echo what you, Bernard, said. When thinking about policy, we need to think through 3 steps. First, what's the issue? State the problem and verbalize whether it is an economic or a political problem. Second, we need to think about, what our measure is going to achieve. Is it really going to address the problem? And is it going to address the economic or the political dimension of the problem? And third, we need to think about unintended consequences, so spillovers of each policy. Thank you.
Thanks. Ignacio.
Yes, well, let me go back to the beginning of the discussions, because I think that the fundamental question that we are facing is whether, despite the geopolitical tensions, despite the differences of economic systems, and taking into account the challenges of the climate transition, is it still possible for the United States, China, the European Union, the Global South to cooperate together in a common multilateral institution? And that is the fundamental question about the relevance or not the relevance of the WTO. It doesn't depend just on the European Union, it depends also on the political investment by the United States. And quite frankly, no country benefits more from the multilateral trading system than China. But I think that the time has really come for China to play an even stronger leadership role and to accept that in order for the WTO to maintain its relevance, it needs to be also more effective when it comes to dealing with issues relating to the level playing field. And that's why I think there's an opportunity now ahead of us to have real discussions in the WTO about how to ensure there is the proper interface between trade and industrial policies, and how to ensure that state intervention in the economy is not distorting and creating negative spillover effects on others. And that's a challenge for everyone. I'm not just trying to point to China, that's a challenge for everyone.
Great, thanks a lot. So let's give a round of applause for our panelists. And I hope to see both of you in presence at the next World Trade Forum. So we'll be in touch on that. Bye-bye.